It began, as most funerals do, with a death. But of course, this wasn't just anyone's death. It was Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, scourge of Europe, self-crowned monarch, and, at the time of his final breath, a weary man living on an island few people had ever heard of. The year was 1821. The place, St. Helena, craggy, wind-scoured speck in the South Atlantic Ocean. It was the kind of place where clouds sat low like mourning veils and the waves always sounded faintly disapproving. Here, thousands of miles from the continent he once ruled, Napoleon died, quietly. In a small, humid room filled with sighs and damp wallpaper, some said it was stomach cancer. Others murmured poison. Still, others believed it was simply the weight of defeat. The man who had once commanded empires passed into silence, and for the first time in decades, Europe didn't know what to do with him. A funeral is normally a time for closure. For Napoleon, it was the beginning of 19 years of posthumous indecision. He was buried quickly, perhaps too quickly. A modest procession followed his flag-draped coffin down a winding path on the island, ending at a quiet valley he had once admired. There was no marble, no grand mausoleum, just a humble tomb between two willow trees and a grave marker that, by deliberate choice, bore no name. Simply, here lies, no Napoleon, no emperor, no titles, just lies. The British, who had guarded him there, didn't want a shrine. They didn't want St. Helena becoming a pilgrimage site for die-hard Bonapartists. They wanted him buried, literally and symbolically, done, finished, forgotten. But it was never going to be that simple. Back in France, things were no clearer. The Bourbon monarchy had been restored after Napoleon's defeat, and King Louis XVIII, who had spent much of Napoleon's reign in very nervous exile, was not exactly eager to roll out red carpets for the former emperor's remains. Napoleon had dethroned kings, rewritten borders, and crowned himself. Giving him a grand Parisian funeral now would have been like throwing a surprise party for the guy who once stole your house. Still, there were murmurs. Murmurs from veterans who remembered their uniforms with pride. Murmurs from families who had lost sons but still admired the man who led them. Murmurs from artists, poets, and politicians who couldn't quite agree if Napoleon had been a genius, a tyrant, or a particularly aggressive performance artist. But regardless of where they stood on his legacy, most agreed on one thing: he shouldn't stay on St. Helena. Not forever. Except no one could agree on where he should go. You might think, logically, that Paris would be the obvious choice. After all, that's where he'd ruled, where he'd built monuments, where his legend had flourished. But to some, burying him in Paris was a political statement, a loud one that said, he belongs to us again. Not everyone wanted to make that statement, especially the royalists, who preferred their kings to be crowned, not overthrown by Corsicans with military ambition and excellent hat posture. Others proposed a neutral compromise, maybe Corsica, where he was born. But Corsica had always had mixed feelings about Napoleon, and the locals weren't particularly enthusiastic about becoming the new center of imperial pilgrimage. Plus, moving an emperor's body across oceans, political lines, and public opinion polls wasn't exactly easy. So, time passed. 1 year, then 2, then 5. The trees around his grave on St. Helena grew thicker, moss crept in, the stone aged. French governments came and went. Napoleonic veterans marched a little slower in parades, and still, no decision. There were practical concerns too. The British still technically controlled St. Helena. If the French wanted the body, they had to ask politely, and even then, there was suspicion. What if the body wasn't really his? What if the British refused? What if opening the tomb started a new wave of revolutionary fervor? The 1820s were a politically fragile time. No one wanted to upset the apple cart, especially not with the ghost of Napoleon watching. Meanwhile, back in Paris, those who did remember him often did so quietly. They whispered his name like a bedtime story, half myth, half memory. They visited the column in the Place Vendôme. They looked up at the Arc de Triomphe. They listened to old soldiers reminisce about Austerlitz and sighed at the sheer absurdity of burying the greatest military mind of their century under wet leaves on a British island. And so Napoleon remained unclaimed. Years ticked by. Children grew up never knowing his name except as a strange, powerful whisper. Others remembered too well and quietly fumed. Until finally, in the 1830s, things began to shift. A new king came to power, Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king, a man who understood the political power of symbols. Louis Philippe didn't necessarily love Napoleon, but he understood that invoking Napoleon's name could rally the people, especially at a time when the monarchy was wobbling like a badly balanced wine glass. What better way to win hearts than by promising to bring the emperor home? But that's a story for another night. For now, we end this first part with Napoleon lying quietly beneath a willow tree, far from the cities he once commanded, in a grave so understated it refused even to say his name. A conqueror, forgotten and undecided over, not with a bang but with a whisper. And that's how a 19-year funeral begins. With no consensus, no marble, and no name. St. Helena was never meant to be remembered. A jagged thumbprint of volcanic stone in the middle of a very empty part of the ocean, the island was the kind of place you wouldn't stumble upon by accident. There were no famous harbors, no great cities, and no convenient ports of call. But it was precisely this isolation that made it useful for hiding away things too dangerous to leave on the continent. In this case, that thing had been a man, Napoleon Bonaparte. After his second fall from power in 1815, the leaders of Europe faced a dilemma. What do you do with a man who once rearranged borders like furniture, declared himself emperor, and somehow escaped exile once already? You don't just imprison a figure like Napoleon, you vanish him. And so, they chose St. Helena Place as far from Parisian streets and imperial ambitions as the moon. There, amid goats, rocks, British officers and salty fog, the last emperor of France became a resident and eventually a corpse. The house they gave him, Longwood House, was not luxurious. Damp walls, mold in the corners, endless wind. If palaces in Paris had whispered power, Longwood muttered decay. Still, it was to be his final residence and, as it turned out, the setting for his final breath. When he died in May of 1821, the British arranged a burial with a surprising amount of dignity, though also a lot of ambiguity. A small party of mourners, mostly guards and a few French retainers, followed his coffin. The burial site was simple, a green valley not far from Longwood. It had trees, grass, birdsong. Napoleon had once said he liked the spot. But then came the question of the tomb. What do you write on the grave of a man like Napoleon? The French entourage wanted Napoleon. Just one word, nothing else needed. It was a statement, a legacy, a name that didn't require explanation. The British governor refused. To him, Napoleon implied kingship, authority, defiance. He preferred Napoleon Bonaparte, the name of a man, not an emperor, a name rooted in reality, not myth. The disagreement grew sharper than expected. In the end, they settled the way only bureaucracies know how to settle, by not deciding. The grave marker was left blank. Not blank as in Clenther was a carved stone. There were lines, but no name, no final identity, just the tomb of someone once important, now anonymous. And so the island of exile became, by default, a tomb. But it was not a quiet one. St. Helena became a strange kind of pilgrimage site. Visitors came not many, given the remoteness, but enough to keep the soldiers on their toes. French ships made the journey. Some brought flowers. Others brought soil from France. There was something hauntingly beautiful about it. This tiny green valley held not just a body, but 1,000 arguments, memories, and futures still unresolved. The British garrison maintained the site with respectful distance. They fenced it, they allowed small ceremonies, but they watched carefully. Too much reverence could look like rebellion. Too much foot traffic could start to feel like revolution. Meanwhile, the people of St. Helena lived with the ghost. For them, Napoleon was less a political figure and more of a story. A sick man in a carriage, a pale face in a window, a name whispered by sailors. Children grew up pointing at the tomb without fully knowing why it mattered, and still the willows grew. The tomb became symbolic in a way few places ever are. It was both final and temporary, both quiet and full of argument. The emperor lay in foreign soil, guarded by former enemies, marked by silence. Time passed. In Paris, Napoleon's memory began to soften. Once feared, he became something LC legend, shaped by nostalgia, romanticized paintings, fictionalized letters, sentimental memoirs. The man was gone. The myth was blooming. But even as poets and painters brushed his image back into the public eye, his body remained far away, under foreign sky, surrounded by birds and British gunpowder. The years ticked by, and still, no decision. Nobody wanted to provoke another war over a dead man, yet nobody could forget he was there. The tomb sat, unmarked, surrounded by green, and people began asking strange questions. Was it really him inside? Had the British lied? Was the whole burial a trick? These weren't serious theories, but then again, in the shadow of Napoleon, few things stayed rational. Myths have a way of inviting doubt, and the longer the delay, the louder the speculation. A strange thing happened in those years of inaction. The tomb became part of his legend. People spoke of St. Helena not as a prison, but as a sacred wound. Some described it as noble. Others said it was cruel. A few claimed it was fitting, but no one forgot it. Not really. By the early 1830s, enough time had passed that new political winds were blowing in Paris. The monarchy had changed again this time to Louis Philippe, a king who styled himself as less royal, more relatable. He wanted to unite the country not just in policy, but in memory. Napoleon, once a divisive figure, had mellowed into something different, a symbol that could be used, even softened, to suit a new age. And what better way to stir national feeling than to bring the emperor home? St. Helena, once chosen for its isolation, had become the center of a very loud, very complicated silence. The British were approached. Negotiations began. But nothing moved. Quickly, not ships, not ceremonies, not governments. So the tomb remained. The willows grew thicker. The fence sagged and was repaired. The birds kept singing. And beneath the stone, unnamed still, Napoleon slept if emperors ever do. Eventually, that sleep would be disturbed. But that's for the next section. For now, the island of exile had become more than a rock in the sea. It had become a memory with roots, a debate carved in stone, and a reminder that even in death, Napoleon refused to go quietly. By the time whispers of bringing Napoleon home reached the cafes and courtyards of Paris, he had already been dead for nearly 2 decades. Dead in body, perhaps, but more alive than ever in story. His image was etched into cigar boxes and romantic novels. His profile was sold on souvenirs. There were statues now, columns, military marches named after him. You could hum his memory or paint it. You could toast to him or grumble about him, but you couldn't ignore him. In death, Napoleon had become something no living man could be flexible. He could be a hero or a villain depending on who was telling the tale. He could be a tragic genius undone by fate or a megalomaniac felled by his own ambition. And best of all, he no longer had to govern anyone. He no longer passed unpopular laws, taxed the bread, or made your cousin march into Russia. He was past the messy part of living and therefore perfect. But with all this glorified remembering, a peculiar problem emerged. The real man was still under foreign soil. The body, the literal bones, the physical proof of all these memories, was halfway across the world on St. Helena, still sleeping beneath the willows. It began to bother people, not just Bonapartists or veterans, but poets, politicians, and pamphlet writers. Back in Paris, voices started asking, how can we honor a man so thoroughly if we can't even visit his grave? Of course, they didn't phrase it that simply. This was France. The language of public opinion was ornate, rhetorical, embroidered with logic and lace. But at the heart of every op-ed and every fiery café debate was the same truth. France had kept his legend, but abandoned his body. It was awkward, undignified, and, for some, politically useful. Enter King Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was a monarch who ruled a very careful middle. Crowned after the July Revolution of 1830, he styled himself as the citizen king, a sort of compromise between monarch and modernity. He needed symbol-safe, unifying, theatrical symbols. And who better than the man who once united France by sheer personality? Louis Philippe didn't love Napoleon, but he recognized an opportunity. The timing, he noticed, was right. The veterans of the Napoleonic Wars were aging. Their stories, once told over wine and pipe smoke, had begun to take on a misty nostalgia. The generation that had fought under the tricolour eagle now mostly watched the world from shaded benches and remembered what it felt like to march in rhythm. They still had medals, still had uniform buttons tucked in drawers, but what they didn't have was closure. Louis Philippe offered them something better, a homecoming. He proposed it gently at first. Let us return the emperor to the land he loved, not in glory, not to restart wars, but to honor the past and, conveniently, strengthen the present monarchy by wrapping it in the softened cape of Bonaparte's legend. But not everyone cheered. Royalists were still uneasy. To them, Napoleon wasn't a symbol of national pride, was the man who had stolen the crown and tossed it on his own head. To elevate him now, even in death, felt like spitting in history's face. Republicans weren't thrilled either. They saw Louis Philippe's gesture for what it was, a theatrical move to gain favor with the army and distract the population from rising discontent. The bread prices were still high, the factories were still cold, but sure, let's talk about a 20-year-old funeral. And then there were the Bonapartists themselves, the hardcore believers who still dreamed of an empire reborn. For them, Napoleon was sacred, powerful, untouchable. They wanted him back. Yes, but only if his return was wrapped in full imperial reverence, not as a gesture from a lukewarm monarch. Louis Philippe had to walk carefully. So the plan was shaped not around truth, but around optics. He wasn't bringing back Napoleon the Conqueror. He was retrieving the ashes, a word borrowed from ancient Rome to sound noble, poetic, and non-threatening. The Return of the Ashes would be the official name. Not Return of the Emperor, not Exhumation of a Legend. Just ashes, vague, serene, politically flexible. Still, even with clever branding, the logistics were daunting. They had to ask the British government for permission. That in itself was a diplomatic dance. While relations between France and Britain had improved since the wars, the memory of Waterloo still hung over every conversation like a damp flag. Britain wasn't thrilled about giving up Napoleon's remains, but refusing would have looked petty. So they said yes, but with caveats. Everything had to be official, formal. The body would be handed over under strict ceremony. No secret night voyages, no revolutionary chants, just paperwork, sailors, and a very long sail home. Back in Paris, preparations began. Designs were drawn, parades were sketched, marble was polished, public squares were examined for optimal viewing angles. The city was about to host one of the strangest and slowest state funerals in history nearly 2 decades late. But before any of that could happen, they had to send a ship, a proper one. In the summer of 1840, La Belle Poule, a French frigate with a poetic name and a crew polished to naval shine, was chosen to make the journey to St. Helena. It would be accompanied by a steamer to assist the slow sail across the Atlantic. The mission was public, ceremonial, and highly anticipated. Paris watched the horizon, some with joy, others with dread, but almost all agreed the legend was coming home. Even if no one could agree what exactly that meant. By the autumn of 1840, the plan was in motion, and King Louis-Philippe stood at the center of it all, not holding a sword or a crown, but something far more symbolic: a long-delayed funeral procession. Of course, this wasn't about closure, not really. It was about choreography. Louis-Philippe was no fool. He knew what it meant to summon the ghost of Napoleon. You didn't just retrieve a body, you conjured an entire memory, full of glory and regret. And when that memory arrived in Paris, it would come with thousands of veterans, banners, speeches, songs, and tears that no amount of political spin could fully control. So he treated it like a delicate stage production. The king consulted generals and historians, asked architects about arches and acoustics, and summoned artists to sketch the perfect solemnity. What kind of music would sound appropriately imperial but not rebellious? What color should the soldiers wear? How tall should the podium be that would hold the coffin when it finally arrived? He even approved the funeral procession's path through Paris himself, walking it on foot in his private time, like a theater director testing his own stage. But while the king orchestrated grandeur, the public's feelings remained muddy. Some Parisians were genuinely moved by the idea of the emperor coming home. Shopkeepers hung tricolor ribbons. Children practiced humming old Napoleonic marches they had only heard in bedtime tales. One man was seen wearing a battered bicorn hat in the street and pretending to direct imaginary armies with his walking stick. Others were more skeptical. Pamphlets circulated warning that Louis-Philippe's gesture was hollow. The king digs up bones to cover up bread riots, one anonymous tract read. Critics muttered that the return of Napoleon's remains was a distraction, a velvet curtain hiding the growing unrest in factories and fields. And yet, somehow, the mood of the city became expectant. Like something was about to happen, something quiet but enormous. Meanwhile, far across the Atlantic, on the wind-beaten cliffs of St. Helena, the real work was underway. The frigate La Belle Poule had arrived, its sails tight and clean, its captain uneasy. The island hadn't changed much. The grass still bent with the wind, the willows still drooped beside the tomb. The British garrison, while polite, watched everything carefully, as though Napoleon might rise up and declare himself governor one last time. The exhumation was carried out with remarkable care. First, they removed the stone. Then came the outer coffins oftened by time, dark with earth. Inside it, more layers, multiple coffins nested like ceremonial dolls. Wood, lead, tin, mahogany. Each one sealed the man further into myth. By the time they reached the innermost casing, silence had fallen. Witnesses wept. Some crossed themselves. The British officer in charge reportedly said, "He still belongs to the world." Napoleon's remains were placed in a new coffin gleaming, grand and freshly lined. It was as if the past were being rewrapped in silk and oak, made fit for presentation again. Not a general, not a prisoner, not a defeated exile, but something else entirely, a relic. The return voyage took weeks, not because the sea was difficult, though it often was, but because the ceremony required slowness. The ship stopped in multiple ports, not just to refuel, but to be seen, to let people wave, to let journalists describe the creaking of the coffin on the deck, to let the moment stretch. Back in Paris, the preparations had become feverish. Les Invalides, the sprawling military complex where Napoleon was to be entombed, was being frantically updated. Architects quarreled about whether the dome should be painted brighter. Priests debated the wording of the prayers. Masons worked through the night to polish marble staircases. Even the floor beneath the final tomb was being reinforced, so heavy was the coffin, and so symbolic the weight it carried. Louis-Philippe made sure his name was attached to every brick. Not literally, of course, but subtly. He wanted people to know, I am the one who brought him home, not the Bonapartists, not the veterans, not the people, me. The king who restored the emperor's body, and therefore, by implication, inherited some fraction of his glory. He ordered medals struck, commemorative coins minted, portraits painted showing the funeral to be, even before it had happened. His government published official histories reframing Napoleon's career as a story of national greatness, not just imperial ambition. It was, as one observer put it, theatre performed with marble and memory. And then, at last, the ship arrived. Parisians lined the river. Some waved flags. Others stood quietly in coats against the cold. They had waited nearly 20 years for this moment. Some had waited out of admiration, others out of curiosity. A few, perhaps, out of sheer historical boredom. But everyone waited. The coffin was transferred from ship to ceremonial barge, draped in imperial colors. Drums echoed over the Seine. Military cadets stood in perfect rows. And slowly, Napoleon was brought into the city. Louis-Philippe did not walk beside the coffin. That would have been too much. He watched from a window, respectful, distant, calculated. The funeral parade continued through the capital, winding its way toward Les Invalides. People threw flowers. Children fell silent. Elderly veterans saluted and cried. For one frozen day in December 1840, the city remembered a man it had both loved and lost, both feared and admired. And Louis-Philippe, from behind the curtain of ceremony, nodded, quietly satisfied, because he knew that memory was more powerful than politics, and bones, when paraded correctly, could be better than crowns. They called it Le Retour des Cendres, the return of the ashes butt. Nothing about it was quick, fiery, or even particularly ash-like. The French government had chosen the term not for its accuracy, but for its elegance. Ashes sounded poetic, almost Roman, and importantly, did not carry the awkward weight of the word corpse. Ashes could be holy, symbolic, neatly contained. Corpses were heavy, decaying, and less politically useful. And so, in the winter of 1840, When Napoleon Bonaparte's mortal remains arrived back in France after nearly 2 decades buried in the red soil of St. Helena, the entire operation was carefully branded, narrated, and designed to glide like a ritual, not lurch like a logistical nightmare. Except, of course, it did lurch. Spectacularly. Let us start with the ship, La Belle Poule, a vessel chosen not for its speed or strength, but for its symbolic resonance and presentability. Painted black for mourning, trimmed with solemn gold, and staffed with a hand-picked crew who were coached to behave with quiet reverence, La Belle Poule was more floating theatre than warship. Its decks had been scrubbed until they gleamed, its flags arranged at precise angles, and its captain briefed as though he were about to lead a funeral for the moon. The coffin itself was nestled inside a custom-built shrine on board, surrounded by candles and watched over at all hours by uniformed guards who stood at attention even during storms. At night, their silhouettes rocked gently with the ship, casting flickering shadows on the lid of the Emperor's final box. Of course, they weren't transporting ashes. Inside that lavish coffin, layered within no fewer than 5 additional inner containers, lead, tin, mahogany, more lead, and something lined with silk lay Napoleon himself, not an urn, but a man. A preserved body so well wrapped that, by most accounts, he still resembled himself. His hands folded, his uniform intact, his face pale and waxy under the softened pressure of time. This was no cremated memory. This was a relic. And relics are notoriously difficult to transport. The journey from St. Helena to the French coast took weeks, not due to sea conditions, which were manageable, but because of the enormous bureaucracy that had begun clinging to the mission like barnacles. Every port the ship passed became a miniature ceremony. Every time the coffin was glimpsed by civilians, there were flags to raise, dignitaries to salute, and speeches to mumble in the wind. Flowers were thrown into the sea, cannons were fired in patterns, newspapers wrote columns describing how the waves themselves seemed to soften around the sacred vessel. It wasn't just a voyage, it was a floating state visit with a dead monarch whose approval could no longer be given, but was somehow still demanded. When the ship reached Cherbourg, on the northern coast of France, it didn't dock immediately. It hovered in the harbor, theatrical and deliberate. The weather was grim grey skies, spitting rain, but that didn't stop the crowds. Thousands gathered to watch what was, in effect, a glorified coffin transfer. Dignitaries stood in wet coats. Soldiers lined the docks in careful rows. And when the coffin was moved from the ship to a river barge for the inland journey down the Seine toward Paris, it was done with such orchestrated drama that it took nearly 3 hours just to place it properly. There were prayers, there were salutes, there was music, slow and sonorous, meant to mimic the sound of grief itself. It was said the notes echoed off the damp stone buildings like sighs, too tired to cry. Now, the river journey. If the ocean voyage was ceremonial, the trip up the Seine was ceremonial and frustrating. The Seine was not wide, nor always easy to navigate. The barge itself, named La Dorade, was low-slung and painted entirely in black and gold, pulled by tugboats that strained under its weight. Everywhere it passed, crowds lined the banks. They waved flags, lit torches, and waited for hours in cold drizzle just to see the shrouded silhouette of Napoleon's coffin drifting past like a sacred ghost. Sometimes the barge stopped unexpectedly. Sometimes it moved too slowly. Sometimes it had to be redirected entirely due to unexpected ice, or local complaints, or miscommunications between provincial officials who each wanted to host their own version of the funeral. In one town, a delegation had prepared a full musical welcome, but were informed an hour before that the coffin would not stop there after all. In another, soldiers stood in the rain for 12 hours awaiting the barge, only to find it had taken a different route due to a misreading of river depth charts. One unlucky mayor gave a speech to a completely empty dock after the barge passed by in the night. Still, the spectacle continued and grew. By the time the coffin approached the outskirts of Paris, it was being followed not just by boats, but by an entire floating entourage: tugboats, steamboats, private barges filled with onlookers, and even small fishing vessels repainted for the occasion. The Seine became a funeral parade on water, glinting with candlelight and echoing with solemn horns. Night after night, people gathered to catch a glimpse of the procession. Even those who had never seen a battle in their lives, who had only heard Napoleon's name spoken by grandparents with tearful eyes, stood in silence. They did not cheer, they simply watched. And Paris itself had prepared. Oh, how it had prepared. Les Invalides, the old military hospital turned mausoleum, was being transformed into something imperial. Architects had been summoned months in advance to redesign its interiors. Painters had frescoed ceilings. Masons had reinforced foundations. Soldiers were drilled daily to perfect the precise posture required for standing guard beside the tomb. Streets were cleaned, repaved, and renamed. Temporary arches of triumph were built across boulevards, covered in laurels, eagles, and golden ends. Public squares were filled with scaffolding for elevated viewing. Thousands of chairs were rented. Tens of thousands of pamphlets printed. Parisians were advised gently but firmly not to dress too brightly on the day of the arrival. Black and navy were encouraged. Flags were to be lowered. Windows were to be hung with solemn drapery. Still, the coffin moved slowly. By this point, people had begun joking that Napoleon was marching on Paris one last time only, this time at a crawl. Some said it was fitting. Others whispered that even in death, he refused to arrive on anyone else's schedule. One pamphlet claimed the coffin was pausing on purpose, waiting for history to catch up. Another printed only a single sentence on its front page: "It takes a long time to bury a myth." Eventually, the barge reached the capital. The transfer from river to road took another full day. There were speeches, more flags, carefully folded uniforms. Schoolchildren stood at attention beside monuments too old for them to understand. Musicians played songs that were already being called ancient, and all the while, the coffin remained closed, its secrets intact, its occupant still and mute beneath layers of silk and tin and wood. Then came the final parade. You might think a funeral procession would be short, solemn, and direct. But this was no ordinary cortege. It wound through Paris like a memory refusing to fade. The horses were matched in size and color. The soldiers in perfectly pressed coats, their boots synchronized with near-inhuman precision. The artillery rolled silently on wheels greased to prevent squeaks. The streets were lined not just with citizens, but with history itself, veterans in faded medals, widows in shawls, poets with damp notebooks. As the coffin passed the Place de la Concorde, a woman was seen whispering her father's name to it. At the Arc de Triomphe, a boy stood on his tiptoes and saluted, even though he wasn't sure why. When the parade reached Les Invalides, church bells rang across the city, not fast, but slowly, like breathing. The dome of the building caught the weak winter sun and reflected it softly onto the golden coffin. Inside, everything was ready. Except, of course, the arguments. Because now that the emperor was home, no one could agree how to entomb him. When Napoleon's coffin finally arrived at Les Invalides, it didn't settle into silence. If anything, the noise only shifted no longer the sound of drums and horses, but the rustling paper of petitions, the echo of parliamentary debate, and the endless footsteps of curators, clergy, and curious descendants all wanting a say in what happened next. This wasn't just a funeral anymore, it was a competition. Everyone, monarchists, republicans, Bonapartists, military historians, architects, and museum committees wanted to claim a part of Napoleon. Not just the myth, not just the story, but the physical remains. Because what lay beneath the gilded lid of that coffin wasn't just a body, it was a lightning rod of meaning, and everyone wanted to direct the storm. First came the architects. They had waited patiently, sketchbooks in hand, since the king's initial decree. Now that the body was finally inside the city's oldest military dome, they jostled for precedence. Some favored a classical sarcophagus, something Roman and Stoic, befitting an emperor. Others argued for a modern twist, glass, metal, and light, to show that Napoleon was now a legend visible from every angle. They fought over columns, debated the angle of the staircase, even discussed how sunlight might best hit the coffin around noon. Their sketches piled up like campaign plans. Blueprints, models, scale mock-ups. They whispered terms like imperial resonance and mourning symmetry. Every design claimed to honor the man best. Every detail mattered. Should the tomb be placed low, to force visitors to bow, or high, to suggest ascension? Then came the clergy. They didn't just want Napoleon buried with dignity, they wanted him baptized again, at least symbolically. After all, they said, he had lived in defiance of the Pope, divorced his wife without church approval, crowned himself without Vatican blessing. Could his final resting place be under a Christian dome, without a kind of divine audit? They suggested memorial masses, re-sanctifications, and even placed a small silver cross on the coffin one morning, without official permission. One cardinal whispered that a holy relic should be buried with him to soften his spirit for eternity. Someone else suggested placing a Bible in his hand. Someone else argued he should be surrounded by saints. Someone else simply muttered that none of this had been agreed upon, but still stood vigil just in case. But they weren't the only ones. Historians arrived, armed not with prayers or chisels, but with paperwork. They insisted on authenticating everything. The uniform inside the coffin, was it really the same he wore at Austerlitz? The medals? The boots? One man even claimed the lining of the coffin cloth was stitched from Egyptian cotton looted during the Nile campaign. Another disagreed vehemently, citing a diary entry and demanding the entire coffin be opened for verification. That idea was denied, of course. But not before 3 separate committees requested permission to study the interior layout of the imperial vessel purely for preservation, of course. One historian claimed the handle of Napoleon's sword might hold a hidden inscription. Another swore there was a map of Europe stitched into the lining of his greatcoat. Meanwhile, the general public had their own designs. Word had spread slowly at first, then with alarming speed that this was the most symbolically charged coffin in France. People began asking for mementos. A nail from the coffin lid, a ribbon from the processional guard. One elderly veteran asked, quite sincerely, if he might have one of Napoleon's buttons. Not to sell, he said, just to hold, just to remember what it felt like to follow him. The government refused. At first, but then, quietly, a limited batch of commemorative splinters was distributed, tiny fragments of wood said to have been part of the coffin's transport crate, encased in glass lockets. Demand was so high that imitation pieces flooded Parisian markets within a week. Some were made from cheap floorboards, others from firewood. One blacksmith even forged Napoleonic ash pins by burning a bundle of twigs beneath a portrait of the emperor and bottling the soot. People bought them anyway. They wore them on lapels. They tucked them into diaries. One woman claimed hers helped her sleep more peacefully. One child claimed his splinter made him dream in French. Even the military got involved. Regiments petitioned to guard the tomb on rotation as a matter of honor. One group proposed that the changing of the guard be synchronized with the time of Napoleon's death each day. Another offered to march silently past the tomb every Sunday. A third simply asked if they could fire a cannon in his honor once a week, every week, forever. Officers argued over who had the most legitimate historical claim to the tomb. One colonel produced a faded letter from his grandfather, allegedly signed by Napoleon himself, and demanded a seat at the tomb's design committee. But the most curious, and perhaps most telling desire, came not from any official body, but from the common people. They wanted to see him, not just the tomb, not just the dome, him. It began as whispers. Wouldn't it be something to lay eyes on the man, just once, even in death? The government, understandably, refused. The coffin would remain sealed. Napoleon's face had not been seen by the public in nearly 20 years, and it would not be unveiled now, but that didn't stop the rumors. One rumor claimed that the coffin had briefly been opened during the transfer, and that Napoleon looked untouched by time, his cheeks still pink, his brow smooth, his hands folded like a sleeping soldier. Another insisted that his eyes had opened briefly in the candlelight, and a guard fainted on the spot. A third suggested that a priest had painted a portrait of the body in secret and hidden it behind the altar at Les Invalides. None of it was true, but the need to believe it was. In the weeks that followed the entombment, demand for Napoleon memorabilia surged to surreal levels. Toy makers produced tiny coffin replicas. Bakeries sold imperial rolls, shaped like his iconic hat. A perfume was released called L'aile Perdue, scented with rumored flowers from St. Helena. The city could not contain the myth it had summoned, and neither could Louis Philippe. The king had hoped the return of Napoleon's body would cement his own legacy, make him the monarch who healed France's wounds with grace and ceremony. Instead, he found himself outshone. The emperor, it seemed, had staged one final campaign and won. In silence, Louis Philippe's popularity declined. But the tomb only grew. People came in silence. They stood in the crypt beneath the golden dome, eyes wide, hats removed, mouths unsure what to say. They stared at the massive red quartzite sarcophagus, mistakenly called porphyry, though no one really minded and read the inscription. I wish my ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of the French people whom I have loved so much. And there he was, still commanding, still dividing, still wholly his, even in a sealed coffin, even in death, even as everyone, quietly, still wanted a piece of him. It's one thing to bury a man, it's another thing to bury a legend, especially one as complicated as Napoleon Bonaparte. After the grand parade, the riverside processions, the polished speeches, and the deep echoing drums had all faded into winter mist, there remained a simple, rather awkward problem. Where exactly was France supposed to put Napoleon? Oh, they had ideas. Grand ones, lavish ones, very French ones. But like most ambitious projects wrapped in memory and marble, the tomb of Napoleon soon began to behave like a miniature empire of its own, full of delays, design quarrels, symbolic battles, and the creeping suspicion that maybe, just maybe, it would never really be finished. At first, it was supposed to be simple. The royal decree had stated that Napoleon would be interred at Les Invalides France's grand military complex, a place of reverent quiet where veterans rested and old cannons lined sunlit courtyards. It made sense. The dome there was golden, the grounds historic, and the building, founded by Louis XIV, was already home to French military memory. Napoleon would be the crown jewel of that memory. And yet, what began as an act of architectural tribute quickly evolved into a nightmare of scaffolding, politics, and sacred geometry. The first issue, no one could agree on how big the tomb should be. One committee wanted it tall and narrow like a stele from antiquity, rising out of the ground like a defiant pillar. Another suggested something sunken into the floor, so that every visitor would have to look down in respect. A third insisted it should be spherical, echoing the globe Napoleon once dreamed of mastering. Someone else mentioned Egyptian influences. Someone else said Roman. One rather wild proposal even invoked the ancient Persian kings and involved surrounding the tomb with live peacocks. The result was deadlock. Debates dragged on for months. Architects sketched, argued, and stormed out of meetings. Engineers sighed over budget constraints. Even stonecutters weighed in, requesting specific angles that wouldn't crack under the pressure of a 15-ton lid. And all the while, Napoleon waited. Not metaphorically, literally. He waited in a temporary resting placey, quiet, vaulted chapel near the back of Les Invalides. His ornate coffin, swaddled in ceremony and wrapped in layers of symbolic cloth, sat under guard, behind rope barriers and hushed reverence. Visitors could file past, but this wasn't supposed to be permanent. This was the prelude. The real tomb? That would take time. Lots of time. In fact, the planning alone took nearly as long as the Italian campaign. One minister joked, perhaps a little nervous, that if Napoleon rose from the grave, he'd be forced to wait in a queue to see his own tomb. And still, the disagreements grew. There was the issue of stone. What kind? Where from? French marble, said the nationalists. Something white and pure. Nord porphyry, declared the romantics. Ancient emperors used it. It radiated power, but porphyry was rare and expensive and heavy. So they compromised, sort of. They selected quartzite from Russia. It was close enough in color and could still be mistaken for imperial porphyry by candlelight. Problem solved? Not exactly. The slabs had to be transported carefully over land and river. One cracked in transit. Another arrived with a flaw in the veining too much white, not enough red. It was returned. New pieces were ordered. Carvers resumed their slow, silent work, dust collecting in their beards. Meanwhile, the dome had to be reinforced. The crypt had to be dug deeper. The light had to be tested. A special chamber was constructed just to simulate how sunlight would strike the sarcophagus during each month of the year. Why? Because it mattered. This wasn't just a burial. It was a message, a shrine, a secular cathedral for a man who had reshaped nations. Every line of the tomb's curvature whispered something about legacy, about France, about memory itself. Eventually, the sarcophagus chamber was built in a sunken rotunda, vast circular pit beneath the dome, surrounded by sculpted angels, military trophies, and engraved victories. The effect was dramatic. Visitors had to descend slowly, as if entering a different realm. Some said it was humbling. Others said it was theatrical. One newspaper called it a throne made for silence. And still, even with the chamber completed, there were delays. The lead architect died before finishing the inner railing. His replacement disagreed with half the plans. New inscriptions had to be drafted. Veterans demanded that specific battles be named on the floor tiles. Others insisted that the word emperor appear in golden capitals. And then came the sarcophagus itself. 7 massive slabs of stone, carved with precision, polished by hand, lowered inch by inch, by a pulley system that creaked like a ship in storm. The final placement took 12 hours. When the last piece clicked into place, someone in the chamber began to cry. No one said anything. They just listened to the echo. It had taken years, longer than Napoleon's own empire lasted. But at last, he had a tomb. It was strange, really, how much noise could come from a tomb. Not noise in the literal sense. The crypt at Les Invalides was quiet, reverent. You could hear the soft shuffle of boots, the echo of whispered names, the faint clink of medals as veterans paused at the railing. But outside, beyond the dome, in the minds of statesmen and soldiers across Europe, Napoleon was louder than ever. He had been dead for nearly 2 decades, buried first on a lonely, wind-beaten island in the South Atlantic, then dug up, then paraded, then entombed again in the middle of Paris beneath tons of stone, behind layers of wood, lead, and legend. And yet, his enemies still watched the tomb like a gun pointed at them. Even now, especially now, they feared he might rise. Not physically, of course. No one expected the sarcophagus to split open like a thunderclap and a uniformed ghost to step out, saber drawn. But in more subtle ways, more political ways, the fear was real. That his return, his physical return to French soil, might resurrect something else, something harder to contain. His spirit, his idea, his story. Because you see, ideas have a way of marching, even when men don't. And Napoleon's story, crafted by his followers, softened by time, embroidered with myth, was already on the move. In taverns across southern France, old men lifted their glasses and said, "The little corporal is home again." In schoolyards, boys carved his silhouette into desk corners. In remote alpine villages, shepherds taught their grandchildren that Napoleon once passed by this very slope, pointing towards some unremarkable hill now weighted with memory. Even the British felt it. They had exiled him, twice, first to Elba, and then when that hadn't worked to St. Helena, a damp rock on the edge of nowhere. They had guarded him, starved him of influence, let him rot under the long sun. But now, he was back. And not just in France, in style, in marble, in history books, in headlines. His presence, once banished, had become permanent, and that permanence frightened people. A Prussian general, visiting Paris incognito in 1842, wrote a private letter to his cousin warning that the stones now arranged over Napoleon's coffin are not stones, but seeds. Another Austrian diplomat called the tomb an altar waiting for a religion. They weren't wrong. The return of Napoleon's remains had unintentionally reanimated his legend, not just among romantic students or nostalgic veterans, but across the bureaucracies of Europe. Cabinets convened quiet discussions. Censors re-examined military textbooks. Pamphlets once banned were suddenly back in circulation. And in these pamphlets, always folded, always smuggled, Napoleon never died. He waited, not under the stones of Les Invalides, but under the skin of France, ready to rise again, not in flesh, but in flame. And France? France remembered. At railway stations, porters, nicknamed unclaimed baggage, Bonaparte's luggage, suggesting it might come marching home on its own. Poets described the Seine as weeping for him. One tailor in Lyon made a suit with 1,812 style lapels and sold it only to men named Napoleon. There were 14 buyers. And yet, beneath the theatrical devotion lay something quieter, something older, something a little superstitious. Because for many Frenchmen, especially those who had lived through the wars, Napoleon wasn't just a memory. He was a warning, and his tomb, a kind of sealed furnace. His bones had been safely across the sea. Now they were in Paris, and no one quite knew what that would ignite. One elderly woman who lived across the street from Les Invalides claimed she dreamt of boots marching every time it rained. A baker swore that his loaves rose higher on the anniversary of Austerlitz. A sergeant in the guard refused to walk directly over the crypt, lest the emperor count your steps. You might imagine that once a man is buried, especially a man like Napoleon, things would settle. The tomb is closed, the ceremony is done, people go home, dust gathers slowly, silently. History puts a full stop. But with Napoleon, there were no full stops, only commas, long pauses, and then new sentences, often beginning with, "But what if?" The drums had gone quiet. The golden dome of Les Invalides now echoed only with the footsteps of visitors, tourists whispered. Priests resumed their morning rituals. The guards returned to routine. On the surface, it all looked complete. But beneath that surface, behind closed doors, inside newspapers, and tucked between the cracks of conversations in coffee shops and courtrooms, the funeral was just the beginning of a different kind of battle. Because the moment Napoleon's body, if it was really his, was placed in the great red sarcophagus and sealed beneath the earth and stone of Paris, something strange happened. People started arguing more than ever. About everything. About the cost, about the stone, about the coffin's design, about the procession, about the wording on the plaques, about whether the emperor should be remembered as a hero or a cautionary tale, whether he had saved France or simply worn it down in a glory-hungry chase, whether he deserved marble or obscurity, whether this funeral had honored him or used him, whether he'd even wanted to come home in the first place. And those arguments, like the man they surrounded, refused to stay dead. Ministers debated the final inscriptions, disagreeing over whether to emphasize his military conquests or his civil reforms. One suggested simply the word emperor. Another proposed a full list of his victories carved into the rotunda's floor. A third worried that visitors would trip on the lettering. Meetings dissolved into muttered insults and reluctant compromises. Philosophers argued over whether Napoleon represented the ultimate individual genius or the tragic folly of personal ambition. Newspapers published dueling essays. Poets weighed in. Painters started sketching new interpretations of the funeral procession from memory, as if trying to freeze the moment before the tomb sealed shut. Historians circled like moths around a candle. Some wanted to rewrite the official record, others to challenge it. A few denied the tomb's sanctity altogether and referred to it as just another pile of dressed-up masonry. One pamphlet even called it the nation's most expensive paperweight. Meanwhile, ordinary Parisians began their own kind of argument, not with words, but with habits. A baker refused to sell bread on the 15th of December, claiming it was a sacred date of return. A widow began lighting a candle every Thursday, because she believed that was the day Napoleon's spirit walked the crypt. Children whispered stories about hearing footsteps in the corridors of Les Invalides. One claimed the statue of Napoleon inside the courtyard winked at him. Was it hysteria, a new form of nationalism, or something else, something older? Because beyond the politics, the budgets, the ceremonies, and the columns, there remained a question France couldn't shake. What do you do with a memory that's too big to bury? In salons, people debated whether the entire funeral had been an act of theatre, a performance to bolster the monarchy, an illusion of unity, a distraction from economic anxiety, a symbol of nostalgia in a country quietly terrified of the future. Because even though Napoleon was now entombed, France was restless. The monarchy under Louis Philippe was fragile. The memory of revolution still buzzed under the skin of the city. Students muttered in the streets. Veterans polished their medals and remembered better days. Writers scribbled metaphors about eagles trapped under glass. And always, always, that same quiet refrain echoed across parlors and military barracks alike. Would Napoleon have done it differently? Of course, no one could know, but the question itself became its own kind of debate. The tomb hadn't ended the story. It had restarted it, rewritten it, given it fresh legs. Across Europe, the same ripple was felt. Diplomats in Vienna frowned over reports of renewed Bonapartist sentiment. Prussian generals updated contingency plans. British newspapers called the tomb a shrine to delusion. Yet even as they criticized, they published more articles about Napoleon than ever before. It was as if the entire continent was haunted not by a ghost, exactly, but by the unfinished conversation that Napoleon represented. And now that conversation had a physical address. Les Invalides. People came not just to visit, but to argue. Not aloud, but in thought, in gesture, in silence. You could see it in the way they leaned on the railing around the rotunda, in the way they descended the stairs, not sure whether to bow their heads or stare directly at the stone, in the way they whispered to each other, as if afraid to wake something. The tomb became a mirror. What people saw in it depended on what they brought with them. To one visitor, it was the grave of a tyrant. To another, the cradle of a dream. To a third, a reminder that France could never stop debating itself, even in marble. And what of the people who had once served him? The soldiers? They came, quietly, alone, in pairs, in regimental groups. Old men, their uniforms too large now, canes instead of swords, some still able to lift a trembling hand in salute, others weeping without shame. They did not speak much. They did not need to. They had marched behind him once. They had seen the chaos and the clarity. They had lived long enough to see him go from commander to exile to legend, and now they came to say goodbye again. But they, too, were drawn into the arguments. Should the empire be remembered proudly or with caution? Had the wars been necessary? Had the reforms been enough? Was Napoleon a man of his time, or a man who had tried to outpace it? And finally, though few said it aloud, was this tomb really the end? Or had the whole funeral simply been a pause? Because history, unlike marble, is never finished. It is chipped, reshaped, reinterpreted. Just like the statue above the crypt, where Napoleon stands in polished bronze, staring forward, as if expecting the future to catch up with him eventually. And maybe that was the real legacy of the funeral, not the dome, the coffin, or even the ceremonies, but the realization that Napoleon could never be laid to rest. Not really. Because as long as France kept dreaming, arguing, remembering, rewriting, regretting, hoping, Napoleon would stir quietly in that great red tomb beneath the golden dome. Not moving, not speaking, but never quite still. It stood beneath the dome, gleaming under filtered sunlight like a relic too heavy for time to carry. The tomb was finished. The ceremonies were over. The marble had been polished. The guards were back to their ordinary uniforms. The crowds had thinned, and the foreign dignitaries had long since returned to their quieter corners of Europe. But somehow, even in its silence, the tomb did not feel done. Not really. It felt like the first sentence of a new chapter no one had agreed to write. Perhaps it was the light, that golden shaft that cut through the center of the dome at just the right hour each day, striking the sarcophagus as if heaven itself had decided to set a spotlight. Or perhaps it was the way footsteps slowed as they approached the railing, not from awe, exactly, but something more tangled down, inherited weight, like standing in the echo of something that had once moved the whole world. And then, of course, there were the questions. They never stopped. Each generation that passed through Les Invalides added its own quiet layer of interpretation. For the children of the Revolution, he had been the culmination of everything they believed a man could rise to become. For the monarchists, he was the inconvenient shadow on every crown. For the Republicans, he was both proof and warning. For the Romantics, he was poetry in epaulettes. For the weary, he was simply a reminder that France once moved with such purpose, whether wisely or not. No two visitors saw the same Napoleon. And that, more than the tomb itself, ensured he never really disappeared. The architects had believed they were sealing the story in stone, but what they had created, instead, was a shrine, not just to a man, but to a concept, to ambition, to motion, to contradiction. The sarcophagus didn't hold Napoleon. It framed him, invited reflection, insisted on conversation. Children stared up at his statue and asked their parents why he stood like that. Old soldiers quietly tipped their caps and said nothing. Students wrote essays that debated his intentions. Artists painted him into their canvases, always with some detail just slightly wrong, as if their memory, or perhaps the myth, was always reshaping itself. Tourists took pictures. Politicians gave speeches. Tour guides whispered trivia to sleepy travelers. But none of it silenced the ongoing murmur, the idea that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't truly an ending. Because France never fully decided what Napoleon was. And Napoleon, in death, seemed to enjoy that. He remained everything and nothing, depending on who was looking. The tomb may have been built to hold bones, but it came to hold something else, projection, the hopes and fears of a country still negotiating with its own story. And that made it not a resting place, but a crossroads where memory and myth exchanged knowing glances, and history waited patiently for its next interpreter. The guards changed shifts. The marble floor wore down under slow shoes. The dome echoed with weather. Seasons passed, but the questions remained. Did Napoleon dream of coming home? Did he imagine this resting place? Or did he dream of marching still quietly, invisibly through the minds of those not yet born? In the end, it didn't matter. The funeral was over. But Napoleon wasn't. Not then, not now, and likely not ever. The tomb may have been built to hold bones, but it came to hold something else, projection, the hopes and fears of a country still negotiating with its own story. And that made it not a resting place, but a crossroads where memory and myth exchanged knowing glances, and history waited patiently for its next interpreter. The guards changed shifts. The marble floor wore down under slow shoes. The dome echoed with weather. Seasons passed, but the questions remained. Did Napoleon dream of coming home? Did he imagine this resting place? Or did he dream of marching still quietly, invisibly through the minds of those not yet born? In the end, it didn't matter. The funeral was over. But Napoleon wasn't. Not then, not now, and likely not ever.